Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. Agriculture is a major source of employment in Pakistan, but it has been facing a secular decline for a number of years, if not decades. What is holding this sector back, and how does the political economy function in parts of rural Pakistan? To talk about these topics and have a deep dive into what ails the agricultural sector in Pakistan, I have with me Dr. Mujtaba Isani. Dr. Isani is a political scientist with a PhD in political science from the University of Muenster. He is currently an assistant professor of international relations at the King Fahd University in Saudi Arabia. Before that, he was an assistant professor of politics and policy at the Habib University in Karachi. Dr. Isani, welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you, Uzair. It's
So I
nice
want
to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you because this is a topic I've been thinking about covering for a long time. And from what I know, your research broadly tries to answer the question about why the agricultural sector in Sindh in particular, with some relevance to the rest of Pakistan, has been stagnant or actually receding in the past 2 decades. Tell us a bit about your research and what you found about what is ailing the agricultural sector, particularly in Sindh and rural Sindh in the province. And what does that mean for the rest of the country?
Yes, so I think my research focuses mainly on Sindh, but I think it is generalizable to the rest of Pakistan as well, because I think I've been at conferences in other provinces in Pakistan, and there, like, people told me that the situation in Sindh is very similar, even though the systems are a bit different, but the situation is very similar in the other provinces as well. So I think, perhaps surprisingly, I think in my research, I find out that one of the major reasons why the agricultural sector is facing a lot of difficulties in Sindh is because of you could say a lack of governance, is that the state is keeping back. And I think one thing that I find out in my research was that that the state has not been able to sort of protect property rights of citizens. So usually what happens is that there is a lot of land grabbing and very sort of powerful, you could say, criminals supported by politicians. They usually allow for what we call in Urdu kabzas, and so this land grabbing is very common. So what happens is that usually people are very afraid to invest in the property sector in Sindh, especially in rural Sindh, because they're afraid that one day their land might be grabbed by some criminal elements. And usually, like, the court system is usually supposed to provide legal remedies, but often, as you know, the courts in Pakistan, especially in the rural areas of Sindh, the cases take years and years and years. And in my case study, for example, I looked at like a case in which the land was grabbed and then it went to the courts. It wasn't being able to, this dispute wasn't solved through the courts. The parties went to like a FESLO, which is a local sort of dispute resolution mechanism. There was a FESLO, but even after that, the dispute wasn't resolved because there's this problem of who would ensure that that the FESLO is actually implemented, and there's this problem of implementation, and because of these, it takes years and years and years for these disputes to carry on, and people are just afraid to invest in such a situation. There are other factors as well, but this was one of the major factors that I saw in my research.
So essentially what I hear from you is, obviously modern agriculture requires a lot of capital investment. It requires mechanization. It requires, in most parts of the world, bank financing now because of the need of mechanization and capital investment. And what you're saying is that the underlying asset, essentially, in this case, the land on which you're going to grow stuff, is not secure. And so it can be criminal elements associated with feudals, associated with political parties, can grab that land for whatever reason as they please. And now you're stuck in a long, drawn out legal process. And so to avoid all of this in the first place, the investor is not going to look at this piece of land. And even if he or she does, the bank that is supposed to provide them the financing may not be too keen or be willing to give a decent rate of interest on it for you to finance this. And that essentially broadly is why we haven't seen a lot of investment in modernization in rural agriculture.
Yes, and I will be talking more about, inshallah, feudalism and sort of also mechanization, because so there were different modes of how agriculture is carried out in Sindh, and I'll expand on it a bit later. But on your point, yes, I think one of the major reasons is that, yeah, people from the outside, from the cities where, for example, capital in Sindh is concentrated in Karachi, a businessman in Karachi would be very, very, very hesitant in investing in rural Sindh, just because he knows like, what would happen if tomorrow my land is grabbed, who would come to my rescue. And they know that there are a lot of criminal elements, which of course, we'll talk about feudalism later, but which you in normal lingo are called like these feudal elements, which can help in this sort of these criminal elements to grab land. So I think, yes, so there's a big fear of investing in the rural countryside. If you want me to talk more about the modes of how agriculture is carried out in rural Sindh, I can talk more about that.
Let's talk about that, because would love to hear your analysis on how the sector works as a whole in rural Sindh in particular, because that connects us then to the conversation I want to have with you is on feudalism. But let's explore how does it work, and more importantly, like I want you to touch upon the dynamics between the people who work the land and the people who own the land, in particular in Sindh, but like the concept of sharecropping and benefiting from the crop that is coming out of this land and the richness of the soil, and how does that impact the local economy?
Right. So I think this ties into into the conversation as to what feudalism in the Sindhi context or in the Pakistani context really is. So basically, I think in the classical sort of Marxist sense, feudalism was this, like, the king granted feudals land and they expected the tenants to pay a particular rent on this land. In Sindh, however, I think, so there are three major forms of sort of how agriculture is carried out in Sindh. One, the old system is the Hari system, which is basically, as you said, a sharecropping system. The landowner is required to provide stuff like agriculture, water, etc. And the tenants who are led by kamdars, and then they have other workers that are called kurmi, etc. So they work on the land, and then the profits are shared 50-50. So that's one system, which is the Hari system. The other system is also, like, which you might be more aware of, is the Theka system. So a lot of times landlords give their land on Theka, so they give their land, which is basically a rent, which they say that we'll give you a land and this is how much money we want in a year or in 6 months. The third system that is prevalent there is that it's sort of more modernized, is that the landowner employs people. And this is mostly in like fruit farms or farms that have sort of more sort of expensive crops. So usually the landowner would employ people that work on their land. And pay them salaries, and of course take the whole profit at the end. But in sort of the feudalistic sense, what we're talking about in Sindh is this system of sharecropping, which is a 50-50 divide. We'll talk more about, inshallah, about feudalism, but I hope that answers your question into how sort of agriculture works in rules. Yes,
but a quick question on that. So you said the profits are divided 50-50. Can you elaborate on how does that actually work, and if it actually is a fair 50-50 divide? But obviously that is also linked to property rights, right? Are the workers, the Haris on that land, actually getting what is owed to them in a fair and transparent manner, or is there other stuff going on within that system as well?
Yeah, in my field experience, actually, they do get the 50-50. Actually, sometimes, because usually the landowners are pretty big, so we're talking about bigger landowners. So in Sindh, a big landowner would be considered anyone who's owning more than 100 acres land, till like families that own 30,000 acres of land. So usually also when the crop is bad, maybe the landowner gives more to the Haris as well. But usually it does, the 50-50 system does work if the landowner works on a 50-50 system. But usually, of course, there are sometimes, of course, there are cases in Sindh in which there is this bonded labor as well, unfortunately. Sometimes when, for example, the Haris or workers take loan and they have to pay exorbitant interests, and then there's also bonded labor. There are situations, but I think usually that's exaggerated. I think the Hari system does work mostly into the 50-50, but there are situations where there is this bonded labor type of situation as well.
So what I'm hearing from you is, from your experience, property rights are at the core of the issue. There is an issue in terms of bonded labor and sharecropping that prevents modernization to happen, although some farms are now beginning to pay wages and in becoming more corporatized, so to speak. How broadly do you see this analysis fitting into the broader agricultural sector of Pakistan, whether it's in southern Punjab or parts of KP? Is this something that is unique to what's going on in Sindh and therefore needs a Sindh-specific set of reforms, or do you think property rights as a whole and reforming that part of the agricultural system to improve property rights is the need across the country?
Okay, so I think Sindh will be very similar to southern Punjab, where there are also big landowners, but property rights is an issue all over Pakistan. So I was presenting at the University of Peshawar in KPK, and there too, people just came up and they said, we were also involved in this Faislo, like there they have the Jirga system, which is a bit different, similar but a bit different, but that also continued for long. Even the Jirga system didn't work there. And so it was a problem there, even in the Punjab, in northern Punjab, even very, very sort of influential personalities, their land has been grabbed by criminal elements supported by politicians, which is usually the case. And so these property rights remain a big problem. I'll also tell you that, so usually in Pakistan, as you know, the mentality is they look up to the armed forces or the rangers to come in when there is this sort of property rights dispute.
That's also a means of different mechanism of Faislo, essentially.
Yeah, yes. And I can tell you from the experiences that I had during my field work is that the rangers and the army also don't come in like that. So unless they have like a personal interest there, or the situation has become really, really big, right? For like small disputes, by small, even if the dispute is like 200, 250 acres, the rangers won't bother to come unless, of course, it's become big. Maybe it's gathered sort of a lot of media attention, or like hundreds of people have been killed, then they will come in. So basically, the state is very limited. And sometimes, of course, as I'm saying, when politicians or the local police are involved, the state is actually involved in the land grabbing. And that's usually the case as well. And so basically, there is this idea of state within state, especially when it comes to these land grabbers, etc. And sort of, sorry, these headphones are sort of causing me trouble, so I'll take them off if that's right.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, so I think, so as I said, the army and the rangers are also not intervening in these land disputes unless it becomes really, really big. And so I think this is a big, big problem. And even if we're talking about foreign investment, which is now starting to come in the agriculture sector of Pakistan, I can talk more about that as well. They are also sort of worried about these problems that they might face in investing in Pakistan.
Yeah, and the army rangers point is important, right? Because even they've gotten into trouble, such as, I think you're right, like their own interest because of the Okara farms issue that has been going on for years now. Lots of claims about violence and oppression and intimidation. So there is, again, that's also linked to weak property rights, the way, at least as far as I see it, based on the information you've shared. Um, so I want to quickly talk about now in terms of the role of feudalism in Sindhi society. And the reason why I want to dive into it, because my sense is that it is at the heart of the weak property rights issue in Pakistan, in Sindh, in southern Punjab, and elsewhere. But also because there is this view that among many Pakistanis that if only we had land reforms, agricultural problems would be solved. And my view, based on what you're sharing, is that even if you did land reforms, if property rights enforcement is weak,
Yes.
and it is still at its core a feudal society, then land grabbing will happen. So you will have a reversal of these reforms, at least. Is that a fair perspective to have? And then, that's the first question. But then secondly, and more importantly, like, how does feudalism work and affect the economy of rural Sindh?
So I think so two parts. I think first, as I said, feudalism, it's not feudalism in the classical sense. It's mostly sort of this idea of sharecropping. So like feudalism is sort of a misnomer. But as you've rightly pointed out, I think, is that I think the problem is not like this feudalism, because actually like land holding in this sense doesn't determine feudalism. So basically you can have criminal elements popping up that previously didn't hold a lot of land, right? And usually these criminal elements, that even if they're not feudals, they're still involved in land grabbing, kidnappings, and killings. So I think feudalism is perhaps not the best way of describe it, but usually when we're talking about like usual lingo in sort of the Sindh province, feudalism is associated with everything that's going bad in the rural Sindh area. Um, and I just want to give you sort of link it to politics as well here, because as you see, like if you see the election results in Sindh, for example, in the previous elections, huge large landholders lost elections. So the Jatois lost from Naushero Feroz, um, um, Pir Pagara's party lost from Khairpur and Sangar. So what I want to show from this sort of discussion is that landholding in and of itself does not determine whether this sort of feudalism is taking place or not. I think the bigger problem here is the state not being able to assert its authority and not being able to enforce property rights. We can talk more about the politics of Sindh also a bit later, but I think, I think feudalism is a bit of a misnomer. I think the problem is that either the state is involved in these things or it cannot enforce its writ.
So that's interesting, because I agree that feudalism is sort of the catch-all bucket that everyone throws all the problems into and say that's the issue, without ever having a real understanding of what the feudal structure is of society, how it intersects with the economy and the politics. But based on what you said, people may argue and push back and say, well, the state is not asserting its authority because the political leaders coming out of rural Sindh actually are not incentivized to do this, because they are the ones who are, that person might argue that they are the ones who are involved in criminal activities and with criminal elements to grab lands. Is that a fair perspective to have? Like, why is it that the state is unable to enforce its authority? Because, Sindhis have been voting a certain way and this problem remains. So how does the ability of this, or the weakness of the state, intersect with how the politics of this region function?
So I think this is again a very fascinating question, because I usually see that people vote in Sindh to gain protection from the state. So I think one thing that happens is they're voting for a politician because they want police protection or something. They usually voting because this Thana culture, that maybe that a politician will save them from the Thana, etc. So usually, as you're saying, that in this case, the state is involved mostly, so the politicians are involved with these criminal elements. And the system has become such that it sort of incentivizes such politics in Sindh. Um, and so, yes, I think this, the state as we see it right now with the politics and the police that's involved, I think that is either partly involved in this criminal activities, or it cannot control it.
That's interesting again, because it's it's this view, right? Growing up in Karachi, and you still hear it on social media, is that Sindhi voters, rural Sindhi voters, don't understand democracy, and they keep voting in the same corrupt leaders and the same corrupt politicians and landlords that have done nothing for their benefit. When in fact, based on what you're describing, the choice to vote is actually a very rational and logical choice, which is that I know this person is powerful and they're involved with a lot of stuff. By me agreeing to give them more power, i.e., a provincial assembly seat or a national assembly seat that may allow them to form or enter government or what have you, um, they may get off my back and stop harassing me at the local community level. So, actually, from a Sindhi voter's mindset perspective, it's a very rational choice. Would you agree?
Yes, I think it's very rational as well. So usually also what happens is, I think this idea of why don't they vote for someone else, because I think there is a lack of choice. So they haven't, even if they're getting a little benefit from the politician, which might be some kind of job, maybe, I don't know, even 1,000 rupees from the BISP, now called the SRS program, even if they're getting a little benefit, they don't want to lose that very little benefit that they're getting by voting for this politician. And if there are a lack of alternatives, like, so the PTI hasn't performed in Sindh, of course, the GDA doesn't seem the best alternative. It's probably a similar alternative. And this is providing them this little benefit. And they keep on voting for this sort of little benefit that they're getting. So unless they see like a change in the sense that they see someone else performing, it's likely they would not change their vote. And they'll keep on voting rationally, either because this guy is helping them get out of the Thana, or in English, the police station, or because they're getting this very little benefit from the politician.
And I think the grassroots point is important, right? Because you have to invest in those local communities at a grassroots level to have the political structure of an alternative that can do or provide the alternative to the FESLO, right? Or the influential solving that problem for them before they actually go out and vote. So it's not as simple as looking at the politics of what's going on in an urban society like Karachi, Lahore, Rawalpindi, etc. Because you may be really popular there, but if you don't have a grassroots presence to signal, in effect, a commitment to that community, then there won't be the incentive to vote for you, because when push comes to shove, you won't be there to protect them, and they're not going to come to you to Karachi for help.
And I think this idea of this grassroots / party structure, I think this is also one of the factors in why sort of the Pakistan People's Party has been so successful in Sindh, because this sort of election day politics, as we've seen in urban Sindh with the MQM, really matters in rural Sindh as well. And because in my research, I also found out that I think the biggest vote, why people vote for a certain individual, is because of their party label. So if you are on a PPP ticket, that would probably be the single most important factor as to why the person will vote for you. And that's not only because of like the Bhutto connection, etc. It's because of this sort of party structure. It is the strongest party in Sindh, and they also think rationally in the sense that they are likely to win, and they do not want to vote for a loser. And so therefore, it's difficult to see change.
That's in, so let me ask you this from as an urban Pakistani who basically grew up in urban, does not have any connection to rural Pakistan at all. Um, when we look at rural parts of the country, there is always this question about, why is it that people continue to vote for someone affiliated with the People's Party, right? Because if you've grown up in Karachi, you see the People's Party as the party of corruption, the party of elite capture, what have you. I'm generalizing, but on a broad level, you will hear that consistently in a place like Karachi. So when you did your research, like, why is it like it just doesn't have? I don't see it as just being a function of the Bhutto connection or the party being present at the grassroots. Like, what is it that the People's Party does right that the rural Sindhi voter continues to vote for that label?
Okay, so I think one thing that I also want is like, I think that the People's Party is not all corrupt. Like, there are people that are good in it and there are bad people in it. So I think, and there are people that, of course, really work for their domestic constituencies as well. So there is definitely the service element as well. And I can also tell you, so this sort of feudalism argument that we were having before. So for example, if I quote to you some politicians that that are in rural Sindh, and these are not big. So the Jatoi is losing from at Naushera Feroz. They are probably the biggest feudals of the area, right? And they lost there. And people in the People's Party, like you can see, like Khurshid Shah, Sayyid Khurshid Shah is a big politician now in the Sakkar area. He is not from a feudal background. He comes from he was previously a lawyer, etc., from a more professional background. And there are many such examples there that that this idea of sort of feudalism does not sort of define or determine whether someone will vote for you. So I think there's definitely a service element. But as I said, I think the party label counts a lot. And of course, I think I think this is the party that is most likely thought to win. I think the voters do not want to be usually with the losing party. And usually also, I think there is some kind of benefit that they're getting for voting for the PPP. So on their part, from the way they're thinking rationally, I think it makes perfect sense for them to vote in the way they do. Although, of course, in the urban areas, we might think of it differently.
So from your research, again, interacting with folks in rural Sindh, like, what have you gathered being on the ground are the aspirations, ambitions, and maybe even fears of the average rural Sindhi, like not someone who comes from a background of privilege, but someone who has been working on the land, or their family, has deep connections to the land, and that's their homeland for decades, if not centuries. What does that younger Sindhi, the non-feudal Sindhi, want to achieve, and how do they approach, or what is their worldview?
Yes, I think so. Can I say something more general about Pakistan and then about Sindh? So
Sure.
I think rural Sindh is, in my sort of looking all over Pakistan, rural Sindh is a bit different from the rest of rural Pakistan. I think religiosity plays less of a role in rural Sindh especially. I think, so their aspirations, I think, like all people, I think earning money is a big aspiration. But I think usually what happens is, so of course there are Sindhis that of course go to sort of urban areas to earn some money. But of course, there is of course this stereotype as well that Sindhis are lazy. But I think they have this sort of love for the land as well. So for example, when they come to Karachi and try to earn more money, I think Karachi can be very brutal in terms of sort of its capitalistic output, like employers wanting to sort of squeeze the last drop of sweat. And they then think, well, was our life in the village better than the life that we are living here, even though we are earning a bit more money? And so I think they sort of then tend to come back. But of course, I think like all people in sort of in any society, I think one thing is definitely that they would want to make their living conditions better, whether it be better housing, better ability to buy stuff, etc. But like, I think their aspirations are very similar to people in the rest of the world. But of course, they find it difficult to adjust to places like Karachi,
Mhm.
etc.
And the point around less religiosity or the role of religion, why is that the case? Is that something to do with the unique Sufi heritage of the people and the land, or is it because the conservative madrasas that have proliferated across Pakistan did not find a home in Sindhi society? Like, what is it that makes them different in terms of their religiosity than other parts of Pakistan?
Right. So I think the conservative madrasas are there. So there are some madrasas sort of scattered around Sindh. But in a general Sindhi village, as compared to a Punjabi village or a village in KPK, etc., you wouldn't find the sort of religious imam or the imam of the mosque or any other religious authority being able to sort of control the life there. And I think that could perhaps be because of the Sufi heritage, but perhaps also because I think generally the land owning class in Sindh has been very secular. And I think they've prevented the mosque or certain other elements to gain that sort of power. I think that's my sort of maybe anecdotal evidence there. But I think that's certainly the case. I think people, like when I go to Punjab and everything, or KPK, people are afraid, really. They're even afraid sometimes whether they should wear like pant shirt, etc., in the village surrounding. But that's definitely not the case in sort of most of rural Sindh. I think that there you'll find a bit of a difference.
That's fascinating. Another question, just from my perspective, based on your fieldwork and research, like what are some other things that you feel that mainstream Pakistanis don't really understand about just rural economy in Sindh, or broadly speaking about rural Pakistan as a whole, when you observe it from your perspective?
I think when we actually think about uh, the problems Pakistan is facing, I think we generally tend to neglect the rural countryside, especially in areas like Sindh and Balochistan. I think their rural Sindh is generally one of the more underdeveloped regions in Sindh, in all of Pakistan. But I was saying rural Sindh and especially Balochistan. And so I think here, I think most people know that there is a problem with development in most of uh, rural Sindh, etc. But I think they are not able to grasp the ground realities there. I think perhaps because I think life in urban Pakistan is very different from then in rural Pakistan. Here, it's not all about, I think in Karachi, there's a lot of sort of um, drive to earn more money. I think, although, as I said, people in rural Sindh also want to earn more money, but I think there it's more about whether they can get the basic necessities of life, which would be healthcare, and a good living. And sometimes I also think that the rural life is a bit better than like life in a place like Karachi, because they seem to be more content. Um, you see, this seem to be because they don't need that much. And sometimes I actually feel sorry for the people who in urban Pakistan with having more, but perhaps not the same level of contentment. And so when we feel really sorry for the people of rural areas, I think we're also not perhaps they are getting their sort of utility out of other stuff. And that's why you see a lot of Sindhis wanting to go back to their places that they want to come from, because perhaps they're liking it more there. Although, of course, there's a need for development there.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the things that you don't get in Karachi is clean air, and that's something invaluable, right? So if you're from rural Pakistan, you're looking at moving to a city like Karachi or Lahore, you're probably going to say, wait a minute, you don't even have access to clean air on a daily basis, and probably poisonous air that is what you're breathing. So there are things that are different, but this acute sense of lack of development, again, like, is this simply a function of the state not being able to again assert itself and provide the basic services that are needed, or is there something else that's going on within rural Sindh that has led it to become so underdeveloped for such a long period of time?
Yes, I think the primary uh, thing that came out of my research was that I think the state not being able to assert itself. But of course, I think sometimes the landowners are responsible as well for not allowing um, or not incentivizing people to go to schools, etc., and not investing in healthcare facilities, etc. But I think I shouldn't give a general statement, because I think some big landowners also try to do some things for their populations. But generally, I think the state needs to sort of come in here, because I think although people privately try to do stuff, but I think in this case, we definitely need more public goods there. And I think private enterprise can go and provide public goods to a certain extent, but I think the state definitely needs to assert itself more in terms of also ensuring that businesses can flourish, and also trying to provide public goods. And I also want to sort of, so I come from district Shikarpur, right? And if you ever read sort of the history books of Shikarpur, Shikarpur used to be a flourishing trade town, um, dominated by Sindhi Hindus mostly previously. And so some of these Sindhi Hindus now are top businessmen all over the world, whether in the US and Singapore, also in India. Um, and we saw, for example, in the previous few years, there were, of course, there still are a lot of Sindhi Hindu families in Shikarpur, but they started migrating from Shikarpur as well. And that was also because they were afraid of these kidnappings. A lot of Sindhi Hindus from relatively affluent backgrounds, they're mostly businessmen involved in rice trade, etc. Their families or their children started getting kidnapped, and they started moving, selling their rice mills, etc. So again, I think the state needs to provide security. And without the state providing sort of these basic functions, I think, or trying to fulfill the basic social contract, I think life cannot flourish in rural Sindh.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like, you can have the private sector step in, and a lot of the talk of town and often in Pakistan is public-private partnerships. It used to be a lot more when, for example, Shehbaz Sharif was running Punjab. But if there is weak property rights enforcement, then the private sector is not going to want to be a part of a public-private partnership in a rural part of Pakistan that's underdeveloped, because what happens if the deal goes sour? Um, how do you enforce the contracts? How do you make sure that the investment is flowing consistently, not as just a one-off, right? So those things at least underlie at the very core. Like, even if you want the private sector to step in and play a bigger role in helping develop parts of the country, if they're not going to feel comfortable and confident about the fact that the contracts are going to be enforced, then they're not going to do that, or demand an excessive rate of return, which will make it unfeasible to do so in the first place. The one thing that to me strikes to me at least as being an opportunity area, right, is that by enforcing or by playing a bigger role in providing these basic services, particularly property rights, you can catalyze a lot of investment flow from urban parts, both within Pakistan as well as from outside Pakistan, as investment into the rural economy. Um, how feasible do you see that happening in the case where property rights are provided? Is this something that, broadly speaking, would be attractive from an economic opportunity point of view, or are there things beyond property rights that also may lead to the economy struggling in the rural parts?
So I think, so two things here. So we've seen now investment coming from especially the Gulf states. They usually work with some landowner to buy stuff there, and the landowner, the big landowners in the area, try to sort of grow a crop they want. For example, for example, camels eat alfalfa or alfalfa, whatever you want to call it. So we've seen on other crops as well, where there has been some investment coming, but they always have to work with some sort of intermediary, right? That can guarantee them that nothing will go bad. And usually these are large landowners, so there's no sort of direct investment. Everyone's afraid of investing directly. And usually also there's some customs, tribal customs somewhere, other customs developed by landowners, that they do not let anyone else buy land in their areas. And usually, and so people, even if you buy a land from someone, they're afraid whether this landlord will actually be able, will actually allow them to grow crops,
Yeah,
etc.
they may cut off your access to water even if you
Yes.
buy the land.
And this, again, I think this is also very, I didn't touch upon this, but I think one thing that is also linked here is that access to resources are also determined by who you know. So if you know someone big politically up, or you know someone in the bureaucratic structure, you can easily get the water courses diverted, you can easily irrigate your lands, you can easily also clean up these sort of irrigation canals and have them sort of paved or cemented. If you do not have sort of the right connections, all this doesn't happen. So all these resources are unfairly distributed. So if a big politician, etc., or a big landowner who has the proper connections buys land, he can easily sort of develop it. But if a normal person, like even a person from an investor from urban Karachi, wants to invest, how will he get access to these resources without, in a fair manner? I think these are all big, big question marks, because again, this even like usually people you think are well connected, even they sometimes do not get access to stuff um, like irrigating the lands and sort of lining the canals, which is very important. The canals need to be cleaned so that water can flow, etc. And this usually is determined by your bureaucratic and political connections. And so it's very difficult for investment to flow in if you won't get a fair distribution of resources.
So it's more, I think it's just to parse out what we've been talking about. So you have weak property rights undergirding or hampering the entire system. At the same time, you have the state that is functional in certain parts, in certain ways, but in ways where it is functional, it has been captured almost by elite interests, whether they're political, landowning, feudal, what have you. It's not one catch-all feudalism. It's several. It's more complicated than that. And then third, you have a set of people who vote in elections and who make a very logical choice to say, I have to make a deal with the devil here, and so I will try to vote for a winner or who someone may be a winner, to the extent that by doing so, I might actually be protected from certain issues where the state may actually assert itself in an unfair manner, right? So it's the way I see it coming out of this discussion is that foundationally property rights system and regime is weak, and in areas where it is the state is capable of intervening, it actually plays the role of not a fair arbitrator, but an unfair arbitrator that's been captured by powerful interest groups, whether they may be politically connected, bureaucratically connected, or otherwise.
Yes, I think you've summarized it really well here. I think that's sort of generally what the crux of sort of what I wanted to explain, I think, yes.
Okay.
Um,
So I just wanted to recap that because it is a complex topic, and I just want to make sure that listeners are, foundationally mentally aware of how the system is set up and working. So now I want to switch to, based on your research, I try to ask people about potential solutions, right? So when you have such a system where property rights enforcement is weak and state capture is high, if I was putting Dr. Isani in front of the Chief Minister of Sindh, what would you ask him to do in terms of reforms to shake up this structure?
I think firstly, I think I would definitely advise him to enforce property rights the best he can. And I think I think they try to do it in extreme circumstances, but the state is sometimes involved itself in this weak enforcement of the property rights. And I think all institutions, whether this is the politicians or the bureaucrats, or sort of what we call the establishment or the armed forces, I think they all should work towards sort of establishing these proper rights. That would be number one. I think number two would be a fair distribution of resources. I think that's also very difficult to achieve when you have very powerful interests that sort of protect access to resources. I think that is very much needed as well. And of course,
and sorry to interrupt you there on that second point. Would you say that the most important thing to fairly distribute is water, or is it something else?
I think so. Water, also, I think lining of canals. Also, right now, for example, there is this locust outbreak. Not outbreak, but the locusts are coming and eating up the crop. And usually, what is happening is that the provincial government is looking towards the federal government to find a solution. The federal government is looking towards the provincial government to find a solution. And only in areas where people are well connected, that they are getting the places sprayed. Otherwise, people are having sort of using dishes and making a lot of loud noises to make the locusts run away. And I think that's the best they can. So I think there is definitely not a policy towards like where do we need the resources the most. It's usually determined by who has the best connection. Sometimes your best connection would be an army connection. Sometimes your best connection would be a politician. Sometimes it may be a bureaucrat. And so at the end of the day, there is an unfair distribution of resources. And so I think mainly here, I think this, of course, needs to be looked at very carefully. And I think it'd be difficult just for the politicians to make this decision. I think this has to be across the board because I think sometimes, as we've talked about before, the politicians themselves may be gaining something positive out of it. So it may not be in their interest to make such reforms.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway, right, is like from a societal perspective, you have a situation in rural Sindh that can be extrapolated to different parts of Pakistan, particularly southern Punjab, where we are at a place that first we need to understand the problems facing these parts, and putting things in a broad bucket of, oh, it's feudalism, or oh, it's the elites that have captured the entire system, or that the voters keep voting in the same set of people who are quote unquote crooks. That's the very simplistic answer, and in reality, the reality is far more complicated and far more nuanced than what we may debate about. And I think my view is if you don't diagnose the problem properly, there is no way you can have reforms. For example, like coming out of this conversation, like the fact that everyone keeps harping about land reforms, well, land reforms aren't going to do much when there is no property rights enforcement, right?
Yes.
And it's not going to work. So, Mujtaba, a couple of other things. You are a professor, so I want to put you on the spot. Like, if you were to recommend a couple of books to people to understand, maybe something that you've researched or political science in general, like anything fascinating that people should pick up and read and pay attention to.
Like with respect to rural Sindh or just generally?
Either or, generally.
I think this is a very interesting question generally, because I think so. This is not related to like so. Usually, I also have been lucky enough to be invited to Pakistan to give a lot of workshops in different public universities. So whether it be the University of Peshawar, the International Islamic University in Islamabad, or the Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, and their notion of social science is very different from my notion of social science. And usually I think political science is thought to be political theory. And they usually tend to associate that with, and people who cannot do the natural sciences or cannot do medicine or engineering go into social sciences. And so I think first, this mentality has to be corrected, that social science is just limited to theory, or I think because most of the work I do is very, very sort of empirically motivated and based on data, and it's sometimes just applied statistics. And I think firstly, I think again, to make better policy as well in Pakistan, I think first this mindset has to change, that that social science is not useful. I think first the mindset has to be made that social science is useful. And then of course, I think I would simply tell them to first read, I think, an introduction to social science methodology, or like any sort of methodology, so that they understand what social science basically is. I think there are certain departments in Pakistan that are good, I think, that do a lot of good qualitative work, but I think there are very, very few departments in all of Pakistan, and I speak them again from anecdotal evidence, but I've been all over Pakistan giving workshops in public universities, but there are very few that work on sort of quantitative social science. And I think that is something that really, really needs to come up in Pakistani universities and the general thinking. And I would just recommend them, please, read methodology of the social sciences and try to then, with proper data, come out with possible policy alternatives. Because if you don't know, you can't just claim to know stuff, right? You can't just base everything on anecdotal evidence. And I think that's the major problem that I see. I think you should have enough data to make a generalization, I think, and that's something that is not present mostly in Pakistan.
So what I think we'll do is, in the description below the video when we post it, I'll actually text you after this to put up 2 or 3 links to methodology articles or books that people should read. So we'll include that. And then secondly, like on rural Sindh, like what is one book that you would say
that's
that people should read?
so I haven't. So there are many books that talk about different aspects of a rural Sindh, be it the history of the peers in Sindh, or be it some sort of mostly historical. So I think there's very little social science work on Sindh, very little quantitative social science work on Sindh. So I would myself, I don't know of a very good, I think off the top of my mind, a good sort of social science work on sort of quantitatively on Sindh. And I think hopefully I can write more in the future on Sindh, but I think it's an area where I think Sindh will benefit a lot if people go into this field, especially rural Sindh. I think there are a lot of people writing on urban issues, and good works on it, but I think on rural Sindh, There are very few people. I can quote you some reports of the USIP or etc. But very, I think a comprehensive work. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, and I think that's really bad.
Yeah, and I hope that if, the 100 or so people that tune in for this every week, if some of them are thinking about social sciences and having a career in the social sciences, perhaps Rule Sindh is where you may want to look at for your research, because it is a fascinating place. And if, as you said, there's not a lot of research that has happened on it in a quantitative way, that's an area where you may want to build your expertise if you're looking into that field. So,
Definitely.
Dr. Isani, thank you for joining us. This was a fascinating discussion. I'll ping you about the articles and include them down below in the description. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you for tuning in and listening to this conversation about Sindh and its rural economy and why property rights matter, and why without solving for property rights, it's highly unlikely that you will see a lot of development in rural Pakistan. If you like our show, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel or like our Facebook page and share this with your friends and family. We'll see you next week.